When you think about the history of MMA, especially if you are an English speaker, most will recall UFC 1 as the first MMA event in November of 1993. But the reality is that's just when it reached America. Back then, we didn't even know what to call it, and when we first came up with a name for it, it was called No Holds Barred, or NHB. That lasted until the reform of the sport due to political pressure in the late 1990s, where we began referring to it as Mixed Martial Arts, or MMA, as a cleaner name. In Brazil, it was already called Vale Tudo, or Free Fighting, and in Japan they called it Shoot Fighting and started a new organization called Shudo, a whopping 8 years before UFC 1 back in 1985. As a matter of fact, they crowned the first 155-pound champion ever way back in 1991. In this video, I've got direct contact with the first champion who's given me some virtually unseen footage by Western eyes, and that's his crowning as the first lightweight champion in MMA history. Something, by the way, I can't tell you how excited I am to share with you on this channel. So I'll trace his story and how it leads to the present day with Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson, its cancellation, the failed booking with Justin Gaethje, and us just waiting again to see Tony versus Khabib get rebooked for a sixth time. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and this is the history of the UFC's lightweight championship. Before I get started, I'd like to give two quick shoutouts. One will be to Yuichi Watanabe himself, who is the first Shudo lightweight champion, who's been gracious enough to actually mail me a DVD of his crowning as champ, which is impossible to find anywhere online, and the man who connected us on Twitter, Fan. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but he's a great bridge between English and Japanese MMA, as he covers it bilingually, and he talks about K1, pretty much anything else that you would want to see from Japan. Anyhow, let's begin this journey with the first MMA organization. Chapter 1. Japan crowns the first champion. So as I mentioned before, the UFC was not the very first league to come around. Sure, fights in Brazil and Japan had already happened, but Shudo was the very first organization to form and, more importantly, put together a lightweight equivalent class. And if you're a pro wrestling nerd, you'll definitely love this because Shudo, the name of the promotion, derived their name from the concept of unplanned, very real, and unscripted moments in the world of pro wrestling. These moments are called, quote, shoots. The most common example of this is usually seen in interviews gone off the handle with tirades, comical bloopers, or someone beating the shit out of another person. But for real though.
You think it's fake? What's that? Is that fake?
You want to let me finish here for a second, pal?
I'm asking you the question.
Then shut your mouth.
With Japan's intertwined history between MMA and pro wrestling most famously witnessed with Japanese pro wrestler Antonio Inoki fighting Muhammad Ali in a wild mixed rules fight in the 1970s, the two forms of spectacle between MMA and wrestling have been linked since the beginning. So in summary, that's why the first official MMA organization, founded way back in 1985, was in fact called Shudo. It also explains why so many pro wrestlers were a part of their early roster and would remain so throughout different organizations all the way up to Pride's explosion in Japan. It's really important to understand that this is the same world that Ken Shamrock was born out of, first fighting for Pancrase and then the UFC. The pro wrestling background that they had was pretty far removed from the WWE variety that most are familiar with here in the West, but was instead rooted in a more realistic style of maneuvers. To convolute the shoot wrestling term a bit more, guys like Bart Vale had scripted matches billed as shoot wrestling matches, where he didn't at all KO Ken Shamrock, but at least managed to make it look a whole lot more convincing than Brock and Kane attempted to last year. It's important to note that this was also a common day thing. It's not just a fraudulent kind of deal that some people did, and as a result, shoot fighting or shoot wrestling is a bit of a confused term, and Shudo itself being the term in Japan used to avoid the confusion. But it still happened. And looking back at some of those old fights in Japan, many of them were definitely not real fights either. Oh hey, there's a Northern Light suplex from Ken Shamrock to Demetrius Johnson's coach Matt Hume in Pancrase. Anyhow, this is an incredibly interesting part of history in Japanese MMA, and I feel it's necessary to understand more about the region and the background and where MMA was emerging from at that time. So then it's no wonder that MMA's first official lightweight champion ever, Yuichi Watanabe, was also a man from the squared circle. And his first nickname sounds a bit like a grisly horror, as he was coined the quote masked shooter, but when you understand that shooter is just a derivative of shoot wrestling, it all fits in a bit more benignly. You might see him listed listed as the quote welterweight champion online, but that's still 155 like our lightweight division because they have their own weight class system with different pounds. And it's been around longer too. Weight class names are a bit of a mess in the sport's history, and we'll see that as we go. So let's get right into the very first title fight. Here's Yuichi in the black fighting Kazuhiro Kuzayanagi in the purplish, bluish color pants. I'll just go ahead and let this one play out because it's pretty fast. It's pretty awesome to see a considerably more rare submission by today's standards like a knee bar get the finish. Being that this is March of 1991 and that UFC 1 didn't happen for another 2 years, it really makes you wish that Japanese fighters were represented on that first UFC show. Even in a short fight like this, you do see competent striking mixed with the grappling, something that Royce kind of only had half of. And considering it was Sakuraba that did break Royce's streak, you have to feel that this could have totally changed history if they had somebody of this caliber. Anyhow, it's a remarkable thing to watch, and with gloves, which the UFC would not adopt till way later, having strikes to the head unlike pancrase and rings early on, and it shows you how far ahead of their time and high-level Shudo already was. Another cool tidbit here is that during Yuichi's celebration, his very young son was brought out to celebrate with him. As it turns out, he goes by the name Shudo in honor of his father's accomplishments, and he now has competed himself in MMA since 2012 with 30 fights to his name, and is fighting Nexus's current 135 champion since 2018. It's pretty cool because you don't see that many second generation fighters doing as well as their parents in MMA. Really great to see that. Anyhow, this first title reign proved to be short-lived as Watanabe would soon vacate his title. It's unclear if that's because he lost his next fight in May to Yuji Ito, which was not a title fight and he felt undeserving of keeping it, or if it was for some other reason unknown altogether. But the championship history of Shudo does connect directly to the present day with Khabib and Ferguson. The reason this is important is because no other leagues had this prestige once the UFC introduced their 155-pound class, and these two organizations are directly connected in that way. And most divisions and other organizations like Pancrase wouldn't bring along their equivalent weight class until much later, and that's why Shudo is so relevant to the UFCs when it arose, because by far that was the best 155-pound class since 1991. Nobody was even close to that. But anyhow, the belt after Yuichi would go on through a couple more hands to get to the West first, next with Tomonori Ohara in 1992, and then a big name you might recognize, Yuki Nakai, who earned the belt in 1994. He fought Gerard Gordeau, another big name of the era, as the UFC 1 finalist that eye-gouged Nakai in the Vale Tudo Japan tournament featured in Rickson Gracie's famous choke documentary. As a result of the gouging, he actually went blind in that eye, vacated his Shudo title, and never competed ever again. MMA's history is just fucking insane. The Shudo belt would go on a hiatus for a couple of years until 1999, when a name you also might recognize, Kel Uno, won it from fellow MMA pioneer Rumina Sato for the organization's 10th anniversary show, and then defended it against him again before heading off to the UFC for what just happened to be the very first UFC event under the Fertitta brothers and Dana White, 1 month after they purchased the company. Chapter 2: Death and Resurrection in America. What's interesting about this is that lightweight used to be called bantamweight and still was when the inaugural title fight happened in February of 2001. Either way, it was still 155 pounds. The UFC and the Athletic Commissions changed it to make way for new belts, which included the realignment of almost every weight class. Light heavyweight was now 205, which used to be called middleweight and only went to 200. Middleweight then became 185. Welterweight became 170, which was previously called lightweight. And then lightweight, previously called bantamweight, weight was called 155. This all became official at UFC 32, but when this event happened, it was still called bantamweight. And this is what makes Jens Pulver a true legend today, because this is when he went on a historic streak as the first lightweight champion in UFC history, beating Uno on that night, then later Dennis Hallman, and of course BJ Penn, before vacating his title due to a contract dispute with the UFC in March of 2002. Fun fact, after losing, he would go on to lose to TJ Dillashaw's coach, as many know him now, Dwayne Ludwig, by KO, who would then go on to lose to BJ Penn while in K1. But of course, he didn't take the UFC belt with him, he couldn't, and in Pulver's absence, BJ Penn and Kel Uno were to fight for the title left behind at the end of a 4-man tournament. It's important to note that the division at this time was definitely struggling. It was nothing like today, and the fighters were seen as too small to be entertaining, a similar thing you might have heard about flyweight in recent years. And so with that hurdle for the UFC, the worst possible outcome for this tournament occurred. It was a draw. Neither BJ nor Uno were crowned that night, and as a result, it plunged the division into exile. After the trouble it caused the UFC, who was still struggling financially at the time, they had decided to simply give up on their investment into a new division that was giving them back no returns. So all the way from that night at UFC 41 in February of 2003 to October of 2006, the lightweight belt was put on ice and completely left out of contention. The division without a belt would continue for a little while, but would stop entirely from UFC 49 to UFC 58. Yeah, no lightweight fights at all. It feels pretty much impossible to leave by today's standards, with the sport's biggest star in Conor McGregor at lightweight, along with the likes of Khabib, Tony, Cowboy, Gaethje, Poirier, so many names in the most stacked division in the sport. But when it did come back in 2006, the belt's woes were not over just yet. After an early success by capturing the belt against fan favorite Kenny Florian, Sean Sherk, as the new champion, would go on to defend his belt in a victory over Hermes Franca. But to say victory, while technically true, doesn't really tell the whole story, as both Sherk and Franca would both test positive for steroids. So there was no champion again, and the belt just couldn't catch a break, it seems. Furthermore, it would go on hiatus for the remainder of 2007. But luckily, that's when BJ Penn had made his return to lightweight after a historic upset over Matt Hughes to win the 170-pound title, vacating it. His subsequent stint in K1 that included an insane catchweight fight with future UFC champ Lyoto Machida, and then he continued his rivalry with Matt Hughes and new rival George St. Pierre on return to the promotion. All of this taking place in the 4 years since he drew with Kel Uno. That's also the time period where he fought Bang Ludwig, and he would start off with a bang, getting his win back over Jens Pulver before finally beating Joe Stevenson to be crowned just the second man in UFC history in the company, alongside Randy Couture, to have one belt in 2 different weight classes. And for many, this is what the glory years of this division were. He managed to stay on top for just over 2 years and set the record for most title defenses at lightweight with 3, and has since not been broken and only matched by Frankie Edgar and Henderson since. 3 defenses is still the record. It was truly the peak version of BJ Penn that even garnered him pound for pound status with the likes of Fedor and Anderson Silva at that time. He just looked unbeatable. Chapter 3: The Invasion. The classic saying goes, all good things must come to an end. And in controversial fashion, Frankie Edgar would edge BJ Penn on the judges' scorecards when the UFC traveled to Abu Dhabi for the first time in its history for UFC 112. It's not an epic fall like we've seen of other great fighters, mind you, but it was no less a sign of things to come. To Edgar's credit though, whatever controversy might have been felt about that first fight, the second one would prove to be much more decisive. Unfortunately for Penn, he would only get one more win later that year in November of 2010, and that would be the last time he'd see a win all the way through present day. But with that end came Edgar's bloom. His stock would rise to epic proportions with the second win over BJ, following defenses against Gray Maynard. Even though this was a draw for their second fight, it was still phenomenal, and the third fight placed the much needed stamp on the rivalry with his TKO finish on the Bully, cementing it as 2 of the greatest title fights in UFC history. By this time though, things were completely changing. The UFC had just announced the purchase of its biggest rival by then, Strikeforce, whose lightweight division would soon merge with the UFC's in 2011, and in that same year the WEC, an organization owned and operated separately by Zuffa for the past few years, was also bringing in their talent.
Is WEC merging with the UFC?
Yes.
When?
The last fight for the WEC will be in December.
It was one of the most fascinating times to be a fight fan because of how much worldwide talent was converging, especially in lightweight. It's fair to say it was even more significant than Pride's acquisition for that weight class because there are far more new and enduring talents at 155. You would have thought for sure we'd be seeing Edgar fight Pettis as he was the last WEC champion with a guaranteed title shot, but because of the draw in the first Gray Maynard fight, Pettis opted to stay active, didn't want to stay on the shelf, but he was swallowed up by a wrestling battle with fan favorite Clay Guida and a shocking upset. So by the time the rivalry with Maynard finally ended, it was ironically Benson Henderson, the recipient of Pettis' Showtime kick, seen all around the world when he won the last WEC title and would earn his place at the top while Pettis faltered with Guida. And it's an interesting past for Edgar. I don't know of any champion in history that went through 3 immediate rematches back to back. He beat Penn twice, drew to Maynard, then fought him again and won, and then lost to Benson twice. It's noteworthy that many thought Edgar won the second Benson fight, including myself, but it was close enough not to really demand a third fight, and the division would just simply move on from there. From here, Benson would establish his dominance as well, as the last man still to this date to hold 3 title defenses at lightweight. This included Edgar in the rematch, Nate Diaz, and former Strikeforce champion Gilbert Melendez. I wouldn't call them the most exciting fights myself, but you still couldn't help but be impressed with his skill and super bizarre and dangerous toothpick juggling in the middle of fights. But by then, that was when Pettis had made his way back to the title after running through Jeremy Stevens, Joe Lozon, and Donald Cerrone. The latter were both knockouts of the night. It was just the tidal wave of force at the time, and when he rematched Benson Henderson in the UFC, it was about as quick and decisive as it gets, catching Benson in a super slick armbar in round 1. And Pettis would reaffirm his place at the top by then submitting Gilbert Melendez in round 2 with the guillotine. Pettis was a real star in the making. He had everything: submissions, highlight reel KOs, the look, and the distinction of being the first man in MMA to ever find himself on a Wheaties box. Like the Drake curse for fighters or the dreaded Madden NFL cover, immediately after this unveiling, it would prove to be a curse, and the perceived journeyman Rafael dos Anjos, who had racked up some incredible wins, including finishing Benson Henderson and dominating Nate Diaz, but he had lost 5 times in the UFC already by then. Once ironically to Khabib Nurmagomedov, who went into a series of long medical layoffs after beating RDA. But there's no doubt he was deserving with those recent wins, and he really proved himself undeniable on that night in March of 2015, completely dominating Pettis from the word go onto a unanimous decision, not just with pressure on the ground and against the cage, but also on the feet too. And it really couldn't have been any better timing. Something huge had just arrived in the sport from the other side of the Atlantic, and these two were on a collision course. Or so it seemed. Chapter 4. A Notorious Gridlock. While RDA had just captured the lightweight title, the sport's now biggest star was just emerging. Conor McGregor was originally set to fight Jose Aldo for the 145-pound strap at UFC 189. Of course, this would fall through as Aldo would suffer an injury that forced a replacement through Chad Mendes on 2 weeks' notice.
You got hit with a body shot? Fucking hell.
Conor would in fact win on what turned out to be a historic night because it was the first time the Reebok kits were debuted, USADA was first implemented, and McGregor would prove to be a pay-per-view star with nearly 1 million buys that night. And so when RDA was next slated to fight Cerrone on Fox at the end of the year, Conor and Aldo would finally go at it 1 week prior in Vegas for UFC 194. This is what led to the now infamous war of words ensuing when the UFC set up a press conference to promote their next batch of fights.
Ask yourself truthfully, if Dana rang you and said, you don't have to fight Cerrone, you can fight McGregor, even though Cerrone was still fit, would you take it?
I would beat you.
When you signed to fight me, it's a celebration. You ring back home, you ring your wife. Baby, we done it. We're rich, baby. Conor McGregor made us rich. Break out the red panties.
And as fate would have it, both men would indeed win their fights. Conor would starch Aldo in shocking fashion that took only 13 seconds, while RDA obliterated Donald Cerrone with a barrage of shots to the body and head. So that red penny night definitely appeared to be next. The two even held a press conference for their fight, but of course that wouldn't end up happening this time as RDA would break his foot in training, and the infamous saga with Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor began, culminating in 2 fights that would last until August that year. In the meantime, RDA would heal up and with Conor busy fighting Diaz, he was able to defend his belt against the former Bellator champion christened the Underground King, Eddie Alvarez, that July. It's almost as if that Conor fight was never truly meant to happen, because not only did he have that broken foot, but just how quickly Alvarez dispatched of Dos Anjos in their fight. To his credit, RDA never actually went down, but was clearly out of it after an unbelievable amount of punishment had him unconscious on his feet. As bad as you have to feel for RDA or any athlete in his position, in just as many ways it felt good at the time to see the Underground King rise to the top. All of those wars in the early years and Dream with Shinya Aoki and later on with Michael Chandler and Bellator were truly some amazing fights. If anyone had earned it, Alvarez definitely had. Not long after this, though, McGregor would have his rematch and earn his very close decision win over Nate Diaz that sent him back on the track he embarked on early in that year, and that was to become the two-weight world champion like he had done in Cage Warriors. And there is a ton that can be said about this year. It was the UFC's first time in New York since the ban in the 1990s after a ridiculously long political battle, and the event truly was huge in large part to Conor fighting Alvarez for the title, but it was also something that felt a bit dirty. Dana had publicly stated that Khabib Nurmagomedov was supposed to fight Alvarez on Twitter, so Khabib was pretty much used as a bargaining chip to book the Conor fight instead, something Khabib was very vocal about when he chose to fight on that card anyway.
Why didn't you get the fight?
Because use my name. UFC promise. I don't know. You know something about this?
End with this.
If you know something, please let me know.
But nevertheless, what Conor did on that night was perhaps his most impressive performance to date. Eddie Alvarez is about as good as it gets. He's the first man to beat Justin Gaethje in the UFC, had fought pretty much everyone possible outside of the promotion, and had been champion pretty much everywhere, soundly beating RDA and plenty of other former champs. And instead of a quick KO like the Aldo fight, Conor beat him pretty much everywhere over the course of 2 rounds and even defended the wrestling. Unfortunately though, this is where the chaos comes in. A rumor that had been bubbling up since early that year in 2016 was that Conor McGregor would be fighting Floyd Mayweather in boxing, something that was thought to be impossible as an exclusively signed UFC fighter. But after this win in the Garden, a bit of time for these rumors to build, they grew so big that it somehow became a real thing because fans all around the world kept asking for it. They had their world tour the summer of 2017 and fought in Vegas in August, where Conor would be stopped in the 10th round. But this whole time, the lightweight division was pretty much left out of all of that, and there were 2 massive challengers that were left in its wake. These men were supposed to fight, but as legend goes now, that was far from what went down. Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov were originally supposed to fight for the Ultimate Fighter finale season 22 in December of 2015, but Khabib got injured. The next time was supposed to happen in 2016 on a Fox card, but this time it was Ferguson that had a lung issue. Then for UFC 209, the year McGregor fought Mayweather, but of course now Khabib had complications with his weight cut, leading to all the tiramisu jokes that you hear from Tony now.
It's tiramisu time, bitches. It's tiramisu time, motherfuckers!
So with that fight off the table for the time being and Conor seemingly away for the foreseeable future, Tony Ferguson was then booked against Kevin Lee for an interim title. This is the first time in the division's history that one was ever created. And at the time, it felt like a stopgap just to sell more pay-per-view buys. But I'll say it now, with how long Conor ended up being gone, it really was pretty justified. The problem was it wasn't the fight that anyone actually wanted. It wasn't Tony fighting Conor defending his title, or Khabib, who was seen to be the #1 contender. And yes, Lee was good and still is good, but it felt way too soon for him. Either way, the fight was incredible despite Lee having a staph infection evident on his chest that cemented Tony Ferguson as the rightful interim champion. Chapter 5, Khabib time. With Mystic Mac nowhere to be seen and no return announced, a 4th booking was set in place with Nurmagomedov and Ferguson for what would become one of the wildest fight weeks in all of MMA history, if not the wildest. It was meant to happen in April of 2018 for UFC 223. It felt like maybe this time the two would finally meet, but in one of the most bizarre turn of events that would make for one of the worst and most unbelievable movie plots, Tony Ferguson, while doing media for the event, no shit, tripped on a cable, tearing his LCL. Not a minor injury at all, mind you, one that could take 6 months to a year to rehab. We'd soon find out that Ferguson is a machine, in fact, and this would not be the case for him, but nevertheless, it was far too severe to keep him on the card. Even still, Khabib agreed to stay on the card and fight whoever they had, and that week certainly threw everyone they could at him. After a dream matchup was announced for the then 145-pound champ Max Holloway to come up and challenge Khabib, the New York State Athletic Commission deemed that his weight cut was unsafe and pulled him from the card. Mind you, Holloway was coming up 10 pounds. Unbelievable. One logical fight that would have been decent to have was Michael Chiesa facing Khabib. But of course, this was also the same week that Conor McGregor threw that dolly at the bus Khabib was on, injuring several fighters, including Chiesa. So he was out. Then his opponent Pettis was thought to be the challenger. Nope, he wanted more cash. How about Paul Felder? The commission said that he wasn't ranked high enough. What the fuck? Commissions never do that. So finally, it was Al Iaquinta that would step in on only a few hours' notice. As we all know by now, Khabib would go on to dominate that fight by not only wrestling as expected, but also taking over the striking game surprisingly as the fight went on. And so as a result of that win, Dana White stripped Tony Ferguson and Conor McGregor of their respective belts. On that day, Nurmagomedov became the undisputed champion. Meanwhile, McGregor would end up serving a night in prison for his wild behavior that week, but the history behind the incident, and stemming from Artem Lobov's first encounter with Khabib that spurned Conor's rage to throw the dolly in the first place, was more than enough fodder for their fight to be booked. In the past, I made a 30-minute video breaking down their feud and Conor's incendiary press conference moments that was unfortunately taken down by the UFC. See the link below in the description, or stay tuned for a link on this screen after the video so you can understand that whole mess. But to say this rivalry got heated is quite the understatement. So much so that when they would fight, it would epically boil over to such a degree that was never seen before in the UFC, even after Khabib won. But all this controversy definitely did them very well with 2.4 million buys, far and away the best pay-per-view sales in UFC history. It's noteworthy that Tony Ferguson did everything he could to keep his name in the headlines by miraculously recovering his knee well ahead of the typical expected 6 month to a year recovery time, and beat the former champ Anthony Pettis on the same night that Khabib and Conor fought. Sadly for Ferguson though, he went through a really tough time over the next few months with domestic abuse accusations that were later dropped and admitted mental issues that kept him sidelined. He would end up taking another fight in the summer of 2019 with Donald Cerrone that ended in disappointing fashion by doctor stoppage, but was no less still a great performance by Ferguson, who got the win. A couple months after that, Khabib would return from his ludicrous $500,000 fine after the 229 brawl and serve suspension to impressively defeat Dustin Poirier in Abu Dhabi, while putting on an absolute clinic against the man who won the interim title in his absence. This time, it was a monumental tonal difference, with charity being a large part of the fight and auction proceeds helping the less fortunate. Since that time, there's been no other activity between Tony or Khabib until this fifth booking was put in place. But then of course, that's where the quote-unquote curse has kicked in again. Both Tony and Khabib have had to pull out of their past bookings twice each, and what could stop a fifth booking of this fight but a fucking global pandemic? It's pretty unlikely it could be rebooked anytime relatively soon, with September probably being the earliest set of dates in all likelihood for Khabib to return, and Gaethje most likely back in the place he was, having to wait for the winner. That's it guys, that's the 29-year history from the first lightweight champion all the way back in 1991 till now, with the years the UFC struggled in the division to the marquee status it holds now. But with all that in context, this fight needs to happen, many even going as far as to say whoever wins could be the greatest lightweight of all time. Whether or not that's true, I'll leave that up to you. I'd like to give another shout out to Yuichi Watanabe. I really can't thank him enough for helping out with this video and actually sending in this unseen footage. And then of course, Karev Fan, who I told you about, who actually connected us on Twitter. So massive thanks to both of you. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching my list, guys. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and like. We upload at least 3 videos per week about MMA, and it really helps us out when you do so. If I missed anything on this vid, let me know in the comments, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at JasonTheHeart, or follow the official channel account at OnPointMMA. Thanks for watching so much, and I'll catch you on the next video.